For in Korea, horses or donkeys do not know how to pull anything. The ponies and donkeys are too small. Not being used to the work, if harnessed, they would kick the wagon all to pieces. They can carry loads on their backs, but the bulls can do this also, so the creature with horns is considered to be the most valuable of beasts of burden. Besides, he fills the purse and makes good dinners when his owner is through with him. You can see these patient carriers loaded with brushwood or sticks piled so high they seem to be carrying small mountains of twigs, grass, and leaves for kindlings, or with heavy logs of wood for fuel. Yet when the bull is very young, a mere baby, he has a happier time than a colt or little donkey, for he lives in the house and is the children's pet. Old Timbertop sold his logs and boards at such high prices that the poor suffered. This was because they were cold and could not afford to pay so many strings of cash for fuel. The people used to say that the old fellow would skin a mosquito for his hide and tallow, so sometimes they gave him the nickname of Skinflay. Not many of the villagers were able to buy planks of wood thick and heavy and strong enough to keep their pigs from the tigers, which came down from the mountains and prowled about at night in the villages. These long-haired and black-striped beasts got to be so fond of pork that even in the snow they would, without fearing the cold or the guns of the hunters, claw up the tops of the pens and get down among the squealing prey. They might get a baby pig at once, or perhaps drag out and carry off enough of a big pork to feed their cubs for a week. All the stables and cow-houses had to be made very strong, for the tigers, when they had gone a good while without food, seemed to be hungry enough to eat a horse with all his harness on, and even a grown-up cow or ox. Yet as a rule, no tiger cared to taste either beef or horse meat if he could get young pork or veal. Old Timbertop was not satisfied to make money at his lumber yard only. It is the custom in Korea to plant the most beautiful trees around tombs or in the cemeteries. When this skinflint heard of a family which had become so poor that they must needs sell the splendid trees which had been planted around their ancestors' graves, he sent his agents to buy the timber. These fellows would load up a horse with long ropes of copper and iron cash, coins that had a square hole in the middle and were strung together with twine made of twisted straw. It was a heavy horse load to carry $20 worth of coin. Arrived on the spot after beating the owner down to the lowest price possible, old Timbertop's men would go out, chop down, and saw up the grand trees, leaving only the sawdust on the graves, while the people wept to lose what they loved. In this way the landscape was spoiled, and this made many villagers very angry at such a man, for the Koreans love natural scenery and almost worship fine trees, which had made the country beautiful for centuries. But what cared old Timbertop, provided he could pile up his strings of cash and jingle his silver? In time, this hard old fellow could think of nothing else but how to get richer out of the wants and sufferings of other people. The wealthier he became, the more he wanted. Yet he did not get any happier. Nobody loved him, while many hated him. At last he thought he would make a trip to Seoul, the great capital city, which every Korean hopes to see sometime. There he expected to receive honor and appointment to rank and office. Timbertop had a relative who was high in the king's service, who, he thought, would assist him, for all Koreans are kind and helpful to each other, especially when they are related. To be an officer, Timbertop knew would permit him even to wear a gorgeously shining mandarin's hat with wide flaps or wings on it, and a long white silk coat with a big square on the breast of velvet or satin, embroidered with storks or dragons, clouds and waves. When he went out on the streets he could strut about as if he were the lord of the universe, for he would then wear a hat so high and with such a round, wide brim that he would not dare to go out during a high wind, for fear of being blown away like a ship in a tempest. In such a costume he would be saluted by servants and the common people, who would bow down before him because they would think him a great man. But how could he win such a position and gain the glory of it? He was not a scholar, learned in books or in law, or a doctor of medicine. Not being a soldier either, he knew nothing of war. He could not ride on a motorcycle as a general did, drawn or pushed by 4 men and dressed in a long red coat studded all over with shining metal with a brass helmet on his head, on the top of which was a little dragon. He feared even if he were appointed, he might fall off the one-wheeled vehicle and show what a fool he was. Nevertheless, this old fellow was so vain and full of conceit that he followed what was once the common custom in Korea. He took his journey to Seoul, leaving his family behind him to live on the cheapest kind of kimchi, with turnips and millet. Now the Koreans are all famous for giving welcome and showing hospitality to their poor relations, and often they do this even to tramps and lazy people. When a man becomes rich or holds a high office, he usually has around him many hangers-on. Some, we should even say, were loafers. So, on arriving in Seoul, old Timbertop took up his quarters in one part of his relative's big house. There he lived a long time and was treated decently, for he always was saying soft things and making flattering speeches to his host. In fact, he bowed down like a slave when in presence of his august master. Yet in truth he was despised even by the servants and workpeople. In order not to wear his welcome entirely out, he had to make from time to time a handsome present to his patron. This steadily reduced both his income and his fortune, and while these were shrinking his family at home suffered, so that by and by he received notice by letter that his business had dried up, and soon no more money could be sent to him in Seoul. While he lingered, news from home grew worse and worse. His wife was obliged to sell their house to pay debts. The next item was that she and her daughter were living in a wretched shanty at the end of the village and were no longer in society. All this time those in Seoul who knew that the foolish fellow was as ambitious as ever to wear the fine white clothes of a scholar, or the gay colors of a soldier, declared that old Timbertop had no brains. They even jested about a pumpkin set on shoulders, or they laughed when they declared that the wood which he had sewed so long had gone to his head. They debated in the wine shops whether, if his skull were opened, pumpkin seeds or timber would be found inside of it. So they also called him Old Timbertop, meaning that inside his skull was a wooden head and no better than that of an idol carved out of persimmon wood, such as were so plentiful in the Buddhist temples. Others declared that he had a real head of bone and brains, but he carried it under his armpits, as the saying was. When the fairies heard all this, they unanimously resolved to reform the old fellow, even if they had to make an ox of him. Timbertop, now poor and bankrupt, knew he must leave Seoul and go home and work for a living. When he made his final call on his rich Seoul relative and told him he must, to his great regret, take his leave and go back to his native village, he was not well received. Being too poor to buy a present to give to his host, on whose bounty he had lived so long, he was answered coldly and told to go and do as he liked. And this after years of fawning and gift-making, not a word of thanks or appreciation. Poor Timbertop was down in the mouth, and his heart was cold in his bosom. He knocked on his head with his fists to find out whether, after all, it had really turned into timber. On his way back, a big storm came on, and when he came to a village inn, cold, wet, and hungry, he begged for shelter overnight. The woman who kept it was the wife of a butcher, who was then away from home. This was an awful blow to Timbertop's pride, for butchers were held to be the lowest of people, and they were not even allowed to wear hats, like the rest of the men in Korea. The woman was kind to the traveler. She gave him a hot supper and let him sleep in that room of the house which had the best stone floor, under which the flues from the kitchen fire ran. So he warmed himself and baked his clothes, which were sopping wet, until they were dry. He was so tired that he kept on sleeping till very late next morning, and nearly to the noon hour. He was altogether so comfortable that to him it seemed as if he were a great man in the capital, thus to receive such kind treatment. Waking up from one of his naps, he heard what he thought was the big butcher who had come home, asking of his wife in a gruff tone of voice. "Where is that ox? I must sell him this morning, for it is market day," he said. In less than a minute more, the man and his wife entered the room with 4 sticks which the fairies had put there, a halter, and a rope made of twisted rice straw, besides a thick iron ring such as they put into bulls' noses to make them obey their masters. Throwing down the iron ring and rope on the floor, in a trice they had thrust the stick under old Timbertop's back. In a moment more, he felt horns growing out of his head, and his lips becoming thick as sausages. His mouth was as wide as a saucer, and had big teeth growing on the upper jaw. A tail sprouted at his other end, and the 4 sticks became 4 legs. Before he could quite understand just what was going on, or what the matter could be, old Timbertop was standing on 4 legs, and the butcher was slipping the ring through his nose. Oh, how it did hurt! It was an awkward job to get the animal out of the room and through the narrow door, and some of the paper on the walls and the furniture suffered. But finally, when out in the open air, the bull, that was no other than what had been the man Timbertop, went quietly along to the marketplace. Any attempt to pull his head away, or to stop or run off, or in any way to misbehave, hurt his nose so dreadfully that he quickly quit. The butcher needed to give only a slight jerk of the rope when the bull changed his gait and was as quiet as a lamb, even though as an animal he was big enough to gore the man and toss him on its horns, or crush him by trampling on him with his hoofs if once he got angry. One would have supposed that Timbertop would be a fighting bull, but no. In the marketplace he stood patiently and quietly for hours, hardly even stamping when the flies began to bite. Oh, that I had been as diligent and kept on at my honest occupation in my native village as that fly, mused the bull, that still had a man's memory. At last there came a man with money to buy. He was a drover who unloaded his pony and paid down many strings, or about 20 pounds, of copper and iron cash. The owner put the halter in the buyer's hand, and the new master then led off Timbertop to be sold to a butcher who lived up in his home town in the north. This fellow intended first to fatten the animal and then turn him into steaks and stewing meat. But on his way, the new owner thought that, because he had made a good bargain, he must stop at a wine shop and have a drink. So he tied Timbertop's nose with the rope to the low wall which enclosed a turnip field, and went inside the shop. But while the drover's wine went in, his wits went out, and he fell asleep and stayed in the shop a long time. In fact, it was, as the old song said, first the man takes a dram, then the dram takes another dram, then the dram takes the man. Meanwhile, Timbertop looked over the low wall and, yielding to temptation, pulled up with his teeth some of the plants by the roots, swallowing them. Presto! The horns drew in and shriveled up. The ring dropped out of his nose and fell with a crash on the stones of the village path. His 2 forelegs turned into arms, the hair and hoofs became human legs, and old Timbertop was a man, and himself once again. To make sure of it, he felt himself all over, pulled his own nose, felt around his back to see if he had a tail, and rubbed his head for horns. None there. He looked down and found he had only 2 legs. Then he swung his arms with delight at being once more a man. "Well named, turnip thou," he mused, "thou green plant with a mustard-like taste, thou hast turned me inside out. Or have the fairies been busy?" He had hardly got these ideas through his half-wooden head, that he was on 2 legs and a man once more and could think like one. Then he started on the road home. Just then the drover rushed out of the wine shop and accosted him, saying, "Have you seen a stray bull anywhere near this place?" Of course, Timbertop, using fine language, like a Yang ban, said there was no bull in the neighborhood that he could see or knew of, and he had heard none bellowing. Then he gave the drover a look of contempt for being so stupid, and for asking of him, a gentleman, so foolish a question. Yet after he was out of sight of the drover, he slapped his thighs, as Koreans do when they are amused at their own smartness, and went on joyfully. He kept on repeating to himself, "Sticks and turnips, turnips and sticks." Then a big idea struck him, as if it were a tap on a wooden drum such as one sees in Buddhist temples. It hit his brain so hard and so swelled his head that his big Korean hat nearly toppled off. Immediately he put this idea into action. He returned hastily to the inn and into the room in which he had been turned into a bull, and stole the butcher's 4 fairy sticks, which stood in a corner. Then he hied at once over the roads towards the capital. Reaching Seoul, he went to the house of his rich relative, where he had waited 10 years for the fortune and the favor which did not come. Going into his host's bedroom, he tapped the high lord of the house with the fairy sticks, not hard, but only lightly. Forthwith the man's head became horns at the top, with muzzle of thick lips in front. His hands turned into front hoofs and his legs into the hind quarters of a bull. Yet he was not entirely an ox, but only half animal and half man. Old Timbertop stopped tapping and then went away to await events, leaving the creature half man and half ox. He knew that soon he would be called in. When the family of wife, many sons, several daughters, servants, retainers, hangers-on, and what not, saw their master half man and half ox, with horns and hoofs, they were distracted. Each one had his own notion of how to get him back into human form, and like his former self. Each one ran all over town and into the adjoining villages to get and call in the mudangs. These mudangs were the people, mostly women, whose business it was to drive out the imps and bad fairies such as had in this case done the mischief. The kitchen maid stoutly declared that Tokgabi had wrought the change upon their master. They felt quite sure of it, but the men thought that the gods of the mountains were punishing him for his sins. On the other hand, the Mudang woman said she would find out and get him back into his human skin if they paid her enough money. With drums and dancing and songs, screams, yells, and every sort of noise, the Mudangs kept up such a terrible racket that it almost deafened the family. There were several of them called in, and they knew that they would all be well paid. Meanwhile, the doctors also kept on with their awful medicines, besides rubbing, pounding, blowing, and sticking needles into the bull and burning moxa, or little balls of cottony mugwort, on its hide. Yet not a hoof or horn, not even a hair changed. The Mudangs declared that the imps had got inside the man and they must get them out. One fellow carried a big bottle to trap the imps and cork them in. Another insisted that they would have to use scissors and snip the skin in about 100 places, thus making small holes to let the evil creatures out. Then they must bottle them up, lest they should get out and overrun the house and infest the whole town. There seemed not so many chances of getting well as 1 hair among 9 oxen, but the wife pleaded that they would put off using the scissors until all other means had failed. She did not want to see her dear husband's skin made into a colander or sieve if it could be helped. At this point, when the din and the despair were worst and had come to a climax, old Timbertop appeared. As some of the family had collapsed and lay helpless on the floor, and as all were too tired to ask questions, they at once made way for him. After looking at the patient with a face as wise as an owl's, old Timbertop solemnly announced that only one thing could save him, and that was a rare and wonderful drug, of which only he knew the secret, but which he could speedily procure. Of course the wife, sons, and daughters instantly promised to give up their all, to see their husband and father himself again. So while Timbertop went out to get the famous medicine, they all fell asleep, tired out, while the oxman lay over on his side, resting his horns and hoofs on the floor bed. For in Korea they do not have bedsteads, that is, beds raised up from the floor. As for old Timbertop, when once out on the street, he immediately began saying to himself over and over again, "Turnips and sticks, sticks and turnips." Going to a vegetable shop, he bought a fine large turnip or turnip radish of the kind that grows in Korea, silvery white and about 4 feet long. He first peeled, then sliced, and finally pounded it into a sauce very fine. Then entering the house in triumph, he woke up the doctors, kicked the servants awake, and announced that the potent drug would soon restore their master. He solemnly bade them all watch and see him do it. Pulling and hauling all together, 5 or 6 fellows were able to get the man-bull on his 2 hoofs and 2 feet, and then Timber Top put a spoonful of the sauce on the big tongue. At once a most marvelous change took place. The horns shortened until they disappeared, the lips thinned, the mouth became smaller. Hoofs, hair, and hide departed into empty air. In the wagging of a dog's tail, the mighty man of the house had become himself again. All the doctors, jugglers, and mudangs packed up their bottles and medicines, and with their drums, flutes, bags, boxes, and wares slunk away, while the family loaded old Timber Top with grateful thanks and compliments. As for the master, he declared Timber Top the greatest physician the world ever knew. He invited him to make the house his permanent home, and showered upon him many gifts, with plenty to eat, and white clothes starched as white as snow. The hats with which he presented Timber Top were so big around and had a brim so wide that he used them when covered with oiled paper covers as umbrellas in rainy weather, but he never went outdoors when the wind was blowing for fear he would be whirled down the street. Besides this, he feared there was still much wood in his head, which might turn into a top and spin round if he were not careful. Old Timber Top set up a medicine office, practiced among the nobility, and became physician to the king. When he visited the palace, he used a red visiting card, a foot long. He had a plastron, or square of velvet embroidery on his breast. He wore a string of amber beads as big as walnuts over his ears. He soon became fat with a double chin and plump fingers, showing that he reeked with prosperity. He lived to a good old age, his family were made comfortable, his sons and daughters married well, and he had 17 grandchildren before he died. Yet all the time the fairies claimed that they did it all. They made the sticks work one way, and the turnips another, and they still play their tricks on the Koreans, especially those with more or less wood in their heads. Sir, 1 long body, and madam 1,000 feet. In the land of morning radiance, where the family names have only 1 syllable, such as Kim, Yi, Pil, Wun, Hap, etc., they wear shoes, but these are not made of black leather. The people neither stand up on wooden clogs, as in Japan, nor case their feet in straight-soled gaiters, without heels, as in China. The gentlemen put on white socks with tough hide soles, and the ladies don dainty slippers with the pointed toes turned up. Common folks' sandals are made chiefly of straw and twine, and it takes a good deal of cordage to complete a pair. Now there once lived under an old stone below a persimmon tree a fair young creature named Miss 1,000 Feet. She wore lead-colored clothes and had so many toes to take care of that anyone who tried to count them soon got tired, so he stopped and called the whole amount 1,000, which was a number as round as herself. She was as proud of each one of her many little feet as a Chinese lady who has only 2 of them. Miss 1,000 Feet was very modest, however, and if anyone stepped on her toes or touched her, she curled up, first into a ring and then into a ball, so that men, by a pun on her family name, called her a pill millipede, for she belonged to the pill family, one of the most famous in all Korea. Miss 1,000 Feet was very happy living under a damp stone in the cool earth, and she played a good deal. But by and by, when she grew up, her parents told her it was time for her to get married. So they looked around to see if any gentleman in the whole creation was worthy of her, not only to make a suitable husband, but also a good match. Now in another village lived a rich, fat, young, and promising male creature named Mr. Longbody of the Womb family. His business was to eat his way through the ground and pile up little curled heaps of mud on the surface, and at this work he was kept very busy. He had to look out for the birds, for they enjoyed eating folks like him. He was so soft and sweet. Constant exercise and moving through the ground kept his body shining, so that altogether, as earthworms go, he was quite handsome and considered a good catch for Miss Thousand Feet. Furthermore, as he had no feet and she had so many, while his body was long and hers quite short, it was supposed that one would make up where the other lacked, and that both would be happy together as husband and wife. Mr. Longbody, when he heard of the charms of Miss Thousand Feet, was of the same opinion. All his friends were pairing off, the males bringing home their brides to their fathers' houses and setting up housekeeping. As he had come of age, he also determined to marry. So he sent letters and opened the business, according to Korean etiquette, through a go-between, as the lady who arranges marriages is called. This person goes to see each of the two families, praising to one the beauty and graces of the promised bride, and to the other the strength and wealth of the future husband. Indeed, she gives both of them a very good character. Finally, the 6 proprieties, or half-dozen rules, had been completed, and the engagement of Mr. Wum and Miss Pill was announced. What a clatter of gossip was at once heard in both villages! No one ever thought that such a handsome fellow as Mr. Longbody Wum would ever marry into the Pill family. Some jealous folks hinted that Mr. Longbody, if he took a wife with 1,000 feet, would never be able to pay his shoemaker. On the other hand, so long as his bride would be content with plain twine shoes, all might go well, but for extra occasions, or if his wife were extravagant and wanted ladies' turned-up housefoot gear made of red morocco such as only the rich folks wear, well, there would be trouble in the household. How could he keep her in shoes? Other persons, however, who knew that the Pills were famous people, wondered how Mr. Wum ever managed to get such a prize as Miss Pill. In the other village, the tongues of the gossips ran on in much the same way. What did she see to admire in that fellow without legs? When the honeymoon would be over and it came to making gentlemen's clothes for her husband, had she any skill with the needle? Could she make a long coat and one trouser leg big enough to fit him? And think of the many days of work necessary to cut and sew the garment, to say nothing of weary hours to be spent in washing, starching, and giving a gloss to such clothes. The idea! Why, she would have to be nothing but a slave. As her husband's sempstress, tailor, and laundress, she would get no rest. Think of washing, starching, and beating to a fine gloss the one-legged trousers which Mr. Wum would often have to change, for he lived in the dirt. Now Mr. Longbody Wum was so busy with his work of excavating the ground that he had no time to pay attention to the village chatterboxes. Miss Pill, however, couldn't help hearing what the women and others said about her, and especially the talk concerning the terribly hard duties that awaited her if she took a husband. While Mr. Wum kept digging at the tunnel 3 yards long, which he was excavating underground, so as to save up and be ready for his wedding, Miss Peel brooded over what the gossips talked about, and over those awfully long coats and one-legged trousers she would be obliged to sit up at night to make, wash, starch, and gloss. Already she imagined her arms tired in anticipation of starching and beating on the Korean luster, without which no gentleman in the land of morning calm ever goes outdoors. If his coat didn't have that fashionable shine which long beating gives, the women would notice it immediately, and pretty soon the men also. Miss Pill's broodings night and day over the matter did not help affairs, and finally wore upon her nerves. She refused to prepare her own trousseau, and despite all her friends told her in praise of Mr. Longbody Wum, she decided to write a letter to him, telling him that on account of his long trunk without limbs, and the great labor necessary to make him proper clothing, and of starching and glossing it, to say nothing of keeping it in order, she felt unable to hold to the marriage engagement and must break it off. But before she had dropped the water on the inkstone and begun to rub up the ink or taken brush pen and paper in hand, Mr. Longbody had got wind of her complaining, and it worried him. Why should he marry one who didn't want him? Then, as he thought it over, being a very thrifty and economical bachelor, B began to doubt whether he could buy shoes enough to fit all the feet of his betrothed. He had not looked on her face or figure yet. Indeed, it was hardly Korean etiquette that he should, openly at least. So far, he had not seen her tiny feet to count them up, but he suspected that, since she belonged to the Peel family, she must have 1,000 feet according to her reputation. When he came to calculate what it would cost him, even in cheap twine sandals, he was startled. When he figured out what ladies turned-up kids would come to, he was so alarmed that he nearly fainted. At the sight of 500 pairs of shoes, however tiny, his breath almost failed him, and he saw himself ruined. What should he do? And when she took off her footgear at night, where should he stow it away? Then, what a noise she would make if she put on rough-soled shoes while at her work around the house and yard. It was horrible for a quiet bachelor even to think of the clatter she would make. Already he felt deafness coming on. Should he break off the engagement? Yet how could any one of the Womb family honorably do such a thing? What would the neighbors say? Could he, if prone to breaking his word, get another bride of a family so respectable as that of the Pill? However, he would sleep over it, as there were some days before the wedding. But next morning the matter cleared up, and he was able to crawl into his hole and out of sight with comfort. He sent a letter to Miss Pill, setting forth the facts, and asking for a release from the engagement to marry. The substance of what he wrote was this, that owing to his small fortune he would be unable to buy her all the shoes, and of the kind which a lady of her quality and tastes required. He therefore could not think of asking her to share his poverty, but begged her to secure another husband who could do so. Now it happened that the letters crossed on the road. Each had a refusal before the ink was dry, so neither could complain. So there was no wedding, nor any frolic among the young folks, or feasting of relatives, and to this day Miss Pill remains single and Mr. Wum has no wife. They were very severe on the girl. All the gossips say that it served the 1,000-footed hussy right. Folks had better look on the good points in a person's character and not dwell upon his faults and defects. On the other hand, in Mr. Wum's village, all declare with one voice that bachelors should count up all the expense in getting married. Miss Pill still goes shoeless, hiding from light under a stone, and Mr. Stone and Mr. Wung keeps out of sight underground, for he has nothing to wear. The sky bridge of birds. No bird is more common in Korea than the magpie. They are numbered by millions. Every day in the year, except the 7th day of the 7th month, the air is full of them. On that date, however, they have a standing engagement every year. They are all expected to be away from streets and houses, for every well-bred magpie is then far up in the sky building a bridge across the river of stars, called the Milky Way. With their wings for the cables and their heads to form the floor of the bridge, they make a pathway for lovers on either side of the silver stream. Boys and girls are usually very kind to the magpies, but if a single one be found about the houses, on the roofs, or in the streets on the 7th of August, woe betide it. Every dirty-faced brat throws sticks or stones at the poor creature for not being about its business of bridge-building across the starry river. By evening time the magpies return to their usual places, for they are then supposed to have attended to their tasks and built the bridge. To prove beyond a doubt that the bridge was made and walked over, you have only to look at the bare heads of the magpies at this time. Their feathers have been entirely worn off by the tramping of the crowd of retainers who follow the Prince of Starland across the bridge to meet his bride. If it be wet weather on the morning of this day of the Weaver Maiden and the Cattle Prince, the raindrops are the tears of joy shed by the lovers at their first meeting. If showers fall in the afternoon, they are the tears of sadness at saying farewell when the prince and princess leave each other. If any thunder is heard, every boy and girl knows that this comes from the rumble of the wagons which carry the baggage of the prince and princess as they move away, each from the other, homeward. Now, this is the story which the Korean mothers tell to their children of the Bridge of Birds. Long, long ago, in the kingdom of the stars, a king reigned who had a lovely daughter. Besides being the most beautiful to behold, she was a skillful weaver. There was no good thing to be done in the palace, but she could do it. She was not only highly accomplished, but of sweet temper and very willing. Being a model of all diligence, she was very greatly beloved of her parents, and her influence over her father was very great. He would do almost anything to please his darling daughter. In due time, a young and very handsome prince who lived in Starland came to her father's court and fell in love with the pretty princess. Her parents consenting, the wedding was celebrated with great splendor. Now that she was a wife and had a home of her own to care for, she became all the more a model of lovely womanhood and an example to all the maidens of Korea forever. Besides showing diligence in the care of clothes and food, and in setting her servants a good example of thrift, she thought much of their happiness. Her service to her husband was unremitting. Her chief ambition was to make his life one of constant joy. But the prince, instead of following his bride's good example and of appreciating what his beautiful and unselfish bride was doing for his happiness, gave himself up to waste and extravagance. He became lazy and dissipated. Neglecting his duties, he wasted his own fortune and his wife's dowry. He sold all his oxen and calves to get money only to lose it in gambling. He borrowed many and long ropes of coin from anyone who would lend him the brass and iron money. Finally, he was so scandalously poor, being on his last string of cash, that he was in danger of being degraded from his rank as prince, and of having his name spoken with contempt. The king of the stars, having seen his son-in-law on the downward way, had more than once threatened to disinherit or banish him, especially after the prince had parted with his cattle. Yet when his daughter, the young wife, interceded and begged pardon for her husband, the king relented, paid his son-in-law's debts, and gave him another chance to do better. When, however, the worthless fellow fell back into his old ways and grew worse and worse, the king resolved to separate the pair, one from the other. He banished the prince far, far away, 6 months' distance from the north side of the river of heaven, and exiled the princess a half-year's measure of space from the south side of the starry stream. Although the king in his wrath had hardened his heart, even against his own beloved child, and had driven her from court and palace because of her worthless husband, yet, as a signal proof of his compassion, he ordained that on one night of the year, on the 7th night of the 7th moon, they might meet for a few hours. The young people parted and took their sad journey to the edge of the starry heavens. But they loved each other so dearly that, as soon as they arrived at their place of banishment, they turned round to meet each other on August the 7th. So when the day came, after 6 months' weary journeying, they had reached the edge of the starry river, and there they stood, catching glimpses and waving their hands, but unable to get closer to each other. There one may see them on summer nights shining on opposite sides of the broad stream of stars, loving each other but unable to cross. Feeling that the great gulf of space could not be spanned, the loving couple burst into tears. The flood from their eyes, making the river overflow, deluged the earth below, threatening to float everything, houses, people, animals, away. What could be done? The 4-footed creatures, fish and fowls, held a convention, but it was agreed that only those birds with strong wings and able to fly high could do anything. So the magpies, with many flattering speeches, were commended to the enterprise. When these noisy and chattering creatures, that are nevertheless so kind and friendly to the sparrows, heard of the lovers' troubles aloft, they resolved to help the sorrowing pair over the river of stars. Out of their big, ugly nests they flew gladly to the convention that voted to build the bridge. Sending out word all over the world, millions of magpies assembled in the air. Under the direction of their wisest chiefs, they began their work of making, with a mass of wings, a flying bridge that would reach from shore to shore of the starry stream. Closely, that the bridge looked as if it were paved with white granite. Then with their pinions they held up the great arch and highway, over which the prince crossed to his bride with all his baggage and train of followers. The tables were soon spread, and the two royal lovers enjoyed a feast, with many tender words and caresses. Every year, for ages past, on the 7th day of the 7th month, the magpies have done this. Indeed, although the star lovers meet only once a year, yet as they live on forever, the wife has her husband, and the husband his wife, much longer than mortal couples who live on earth. It is law in the magpie kingdom that no bird can shirk this work. Any magpie that tries to get out of the task and that is too bad or lazy to do its part in bridge building is chased away by the Korean children, who want no such truant around. For does not every girl hope to be as diligent and accomplished as the star princess, so that when she grows up she may make as good a wife as the lovely lady that every year stands by the starry river to meet her lord? As for the boys, it is hoped that they will become as faithful husbands as the penitent bridegroom who every year on the night of August 7th awaits his bride on the shining shore of the river of stars. Lonka, the dancing girl. After the islanders in the Eastern Ocean had found out how rich Korea was, they were not satisfied with their own land. They seemed to have eyes like dragonflies that wanted everything they saw. They kept on borrowing until they got many of the plants and animals which they now possess, which, as everybody knows, came from the land of morning glory. Even the neko, or Korean cat, was carried over to the islands, though in some way it lost its tail on the voyage or else had it bobbed. This is the reason why poor pussy in these islands seems to carry around with her something like a corkscrew instead of a tail. Moreover, when the Korean puss, that had so long been accustomed to scrambling over the roofs and back alleys at home, was introduced into the islands, it was thought to be a wild animal, and for a long time was treated as a fox or badger would be. However, because it kept down the rats and the mice, this bobtailed puss was highly valued. Yet not content with borrowing so many things, the greedy Islemen thought they might as well have all Korea and everything in it, and then go further and overrun China. So they sent a great army and a mighty fleet of ships to invade the Koreans' country. They took horses with them, but as their soldiers were fed chiefly on rice, salt fish, and pickles, they did not need any wagons. They had only oxen to draw their carts, for they had never trained horses to pull anything, but only to be pack and saddle animals. This army of islanders marched to the capital, in which were palaces and pagodas. Then they sent one of their armies along the seafront and another along the west coast. They expected to march into China, but two things happened to prevent this. So, after they had wasted and tarried in the country for 5 years, they gave it up and were sent home flying. From the north, a Chinese army came to the help of the Koreans and drove the Islemen to the coast. But when they got there, they found their ships were gone. A clever Korean admiral had invented an ironclad ship that rammed and sunk their war junks, so their army had to wait till a new fleet of ships had been built and then came over to take them back. But before the islanders left Korea, they smashed statues and monuments, broke up images, and even the observatories for the study of the stars. They took marble pagodas apart to load on their ships and carry away. They enticed or forced to go with them hundreds of the Korean potters, artists, and craftsmen. For, by this time, the islanders had given up living in huts of straw and roving about like Arabs or gypsies. They had cities with paved streets, like as in Korea, though they had none of the beautiful marble pagodas and images and temples, for everything was of wood, while thousands of large buildings and images in Korea were of stone, chiseled into beautiful forms. Now in Korea there were some beautiful daughters of the land and many noblemen and men of courage who determined not to be carried away from their dearly beloved country. Of this, in southern Korea, the Rock of the Fallen Flower is to this day the witness. Over 300 years ago, when the terrible fighting dwarfs, as the Koreans called their enemies, came, they encamped in a town where lived a beautiful dancing girl named Longa. Being a geisang, geisha, or accomplished young lady, she could sing beautifully. The islanders took this lovely damsel prisoner and made her a waitress in the general's tent. One night a great banquet was given in a famous pleasure hall named the Cliff House, because it was built on the high bank overlooking a deep river. All the chief captains were invited, and the large room was illuminated with 1,000 wax lights. These were tall and square candles, molded into a beautiful shape, and each one was painted and decorated with figures of flowers, birds, and pet animals. Very odd and ornamental is a Korean candle. Oh, how charming was the dancer, and what a beautiful sight to behold was her graceful posing. For Korean dances tell stories of birds and flowers, of summer, and of lovely snow-covered landscapes in winter, of a boat in a storm, of a tiger in a trap, of a brave soldier in battle, or a sad lady in the palace, or of the fairy tales of the Western Queen Mother, and many others. Those who watch the dance and know the manners and customs, the dancer's gestures and poses, the motions of her fan and sleeves, besides the games of the children, the sports of the people, the harvest songs, and the fun at the festivals, can read, because they see, the story of each told in most graceful motions. There are several languages besides words which are spoken, and these appeal to the eye instead of the ear. The pretty dancer was robed in pure white with ermine-edged slippers and jeweled girdle, and her shining hair was done up like a queen's. Loud was the applause among the spectators at the end of every dance. After the dinner was over, the general of the islanders grew very lively because he had drunk much wine and was not satisfied to see the dances of the lovely girl. Some of the rude soldiers also wanted to waltz with the beautiful maiden. But it was not the custom for Korean virgins to dance or waltz with male partners, for in this country of gentle manners dancing is by the sexes apart. Yet the rough islanders insisted and forced her so hard that she felt that both her own modesty and her country were outraged. She thought of the thousands of her countrymen, brothers, fathers, and friends who had died on the battlefield in defending their beloved land. Why should not she? So, pretending to yield to her country's enemies, she drew the general out of the banqueting hall and down toward the river, close to the edge of the rock. Before he knew her purpose, she seized his hands and leaped out, dragging her enemy with her over the cliff, and both passed into the other world. She died for her country. To this day the Rock of the Falling Flower is pointed out, and a story is told that here was exhibited a woman's devotion to her country. Around this rock poets have entwined their verses, while romantic associations cluster like the azalea flowers that cover the hills of Korea with a riot of color, making their land seem to the natives the most beautiful on earth. A frog for a husband. Off in a valley among very stony mountains lived an old farmer named Pak Wee and his wife. His land was poor, and he had to toil from sunrise to sunset, and often in the night when the moon was shining, to get food. No child had ever come to his home, and he was in too great straits of poverty to adopt a son. So he took his amusement in fishing in the pond higher up on the hills that fed the stream which watered his millet and rice fields. Being very skillful, he often caught a good string of fish, and these he sold in the village nearby to get for himself and his wife the few comforts they needed. Thus the old couple kept themselves happy despite their cheerless life, though they often wondered what would become of them when they got too old to work. But one summer Puck noticed that there were fewer fish in the pond, and that every day they seemed to be less in number. Where he used to catch a stringful in an hour, he could hardly get half that many during a whole day. What was the matter? Was he getting less skillful? Was the bait poor? Not at all. His worms were as fat, his hooks and lines in as good order, and his eyesight was as keen as ever. When Puck noticed also that the water was getting shallower, he was startled. Could it be that the pond was drying up? Things grew worse day by day until at last there were no fish. Where once sparkled the wavelets of a pond was now an arid waste of earth and stones, over which trickled hardly more than a narrow rill which he could jump over. No fish and no pond meant no water for his rice fields. In horror at the idea of starving or having to move away from his old home and become a pauper, Puck looked down from what had been the banks of the pond to find the cause of all this trouble. There in the mud among the pebbles he saw a bullfrog nearly as big as an elephant, blinking at him with its huge round eyes. In a rage the farmer Puck burst out, charging the frog with cruelty in eating up all the fish and drinking up all the water, threatening starvation to man and wife. Then Puck proceeded to curse the whole line of the frog's ancestors and relatives, especially in the female line, for 8 generations back, as Koreans usually do. But instead of being sorry or showing any anger at such a scolding, the bullfrog only blinked and bowed, saying, "Don't worry, Farmer Pack, you'll be glad of it by and by. Besides, I want to go home with you and live in your house." "What? Occupy my home, you clammy reptile? No, you won't," said Pack. "Oh, but I have news to tell you, and you won't be sorry, for you see what I can do. Better take me in." Old Pack thought it over. How should he face his wife with such a guest? But then the frog had news to tell, and that might please the old lady, who was fond of gossip. Since her husband was not very talkative, she might be willing to harbor so strange a guest. So they started down the valley. Puck shuffled along as fast as his old shins could move, but the bullfrog covered the distance in a few leaps, for his hind legs were 3 feet long. Arrived at his door, Mrs. Puck was horrified at the prospect of boarding such a guest. But when the husband told her that Froggy knew all about everybody and could chat interestingly by the hour, she changed her manner and bade him welcome. Indeed, she so warmed in friendliness that she gave him one of her best rooms. All the leaves, grass, and brushwood that had been gathered in the woodshed to supply the kitchen fire and house flues was carried into the room. There it was doused with tubs of water to make a nice soft place, such as bullfrogs like. After this he was fed all the worms he wanted. Then after his dinner and a nap, Mrs. Puck and Mr. Puck donned their best clothes and went in to make a formal call on their guest. Mr. Bullfrog was so affable and charming in conversation, besides telling so many good stories and serving up so many dainty bits of gossip, that Mrs. Puck was delighted beyond expression. Indeed, she felt almost like adopting Froggy as her son. The night passed quietly away, but when the first rays of light appeared, Froggy was out on the porch singing a most melodious tune to the rising sun. When Mr. and Mrs. Puck rose up to greet their guest and to hear his song, they were amazed to find that the music was bringing them blessings. Everything they had wished for during their whole lives seemed now at hand, with more undreamed of coming in troops. In the yard stood oxen, donkeys, and horses loaded with every kind of box, bale and bundle waiting to be unloaded, and more were coming. Stout men porters appeared and began to unpack, while troops of lovely girls in shining white took from the men's hands beautiful things made of jade, gold, and silver. There were fine clothes and hats for Mr. Pack, jade-tipped hairpins, tortoiseshell and ivory combs, silk gowns, embroidered and jeweled girdles, and every sort of frocks and woman's garments for Mrs. Pack, besides inlaid cabinets, clothes, racks, and wardrobes. Above all was a polished metal mirror that looked like the full autumn moon, over which Mrs. Pack was now tempted to spend every minute of her time. 4 or 5 of the prettiest maidens they had ever seen in all their lives danced, sang, and played sweetest music. The unpacking of boxes, bales, and bundles continued. Tables of jade and finest sandalwood were spread with the richest foods and wines. Soon, under the skillful hands of carpenters and decorators, instead of oiled paper on the floors, covering old bricks and broken flat stones set over the flues, and smoky rafters and mud walls poorly papered, there rose a new house. It had elegant wide halls and large rooms with partitions made of choicest joiner work. It was furnished with growing flowers, game boards for chess, and had everything in it like a palace. As for the riches of the larder and the good things to eat daily laid on the table, no pen but a Korean's can tell of them all. In the new storehouse were piles of dried fish, edible seaweed, bags of rice, bins of millet, tubs of kimchi made of various sorts of the pepper hash and Korean hot pickle in which the natives delight, to say nothing of peaches, pears, persimmons, chestnuts, honey, barley, sugar, candy, cake, and pastry, all arranged in high piles and in gay colors. The old couple seemed able to eat and enjoy twice as big dinners as formerly, for all the while the adopted bullfrog was very entertaining. Mr. and Mrs. Pack laughed continually, declaring they had never heard such good stories as he told. The good wife was, however, quite equal to her guest in retailing gossip. One of her favorite subjects, of which she never tired, was the beauty and charm of Miss Peach. She was the accomplished daughter of the big Yangban, or nobleman, Mr. Poom, who lived in a great house with a host of servants and retainers in the next village and Mrs. Village. Pak insisted there was no young woman in the world like her. It was noticed that Mr. Bullfrog was particularly interested when Miss Peach Poom was the subject of the old lady's praises. After a week of such luxury, during which Mr. and Mrs. Park seemed to dwell in the nirvana, or paradise, which the good priests often talked about, Mr. Park's full cup of joy was dashed to earth when the bullfrog informed him that he intended to marry, and that Mr. Park must get him a wife. Still worse than that, Park was informed by the frog that he would have no one but Miss Peach, the daughter of Poom, so renowned for her beauty and graces. At this, old Pack went nearly wild. He begged to be excused from the task, but the bullfrog was inexorable. So, after imprecating his wife's tongue for ever putting it into the frog's head to marry Miss Peach, he donned his fine clothes and set out to see Mr. Poom. He expected to be beaten to death for his brazen effrontery in asking a noble lady to marry a frog. Now this Mr. Poom had long been the magistrate of a district who had squeezed much money wrongly from the poor people over whom he ruled, and having won great wealth, had retired and come back to his native place to live. This man had 2 daughters married, but the third, the youngest and most beautiful, Miss Peach, was now 18 years old. Arriving at the Poom's grand mansion, Mr. Park told of the suitor's wealth, power and fame, high position and promise, and how he had made the old couple happy. Old Poom had pricked up his ears from the first mention of riches and power, and became highly interested as Pak went on sounding the praises of his prospective son-in-law. "And what is his name?" asked Mr. Poom. Here Pak was in a quandary. He knew that the frog family was the oldest and most numerous in the world, and was famous for fine voices. He fell into a brown study for a few minutes. Then, looking up, he declared that he had so long thought of the suitor's graces and accomplishments that he had forgotten his name, and could not then recall it. So Mr. Poom, in order to help Pak out, ran over the list of famous families in Korea, reciting the names of the Kims, Sims, Mins, the Hos, Chos, Kos, Kwangs, and Hongs, etc., etc., for Mr. Poom was an authority on the Korean peerage. "It is none of these," said Puck. "I deeply regret that I cannot recall the name." "Strange," said Mr. Poom. "I have named all the families of any standing in the kingdom. What is his office or rank, and where do his relations live?" Puck was pressed so hard by Mr. Poom's searching questions that at last he had to confess that the suitor for the beautiful maiden was not a man but a frog. "What? Do you want me to marry my daughter to a pond croaker? You shall suffer for thus insulting me in my own house. Slaves, bring the cross-bench and give this wretch 20 blows." Forthwith, while 4 men brought out the whipping bench, 3 others seized poor Puck, stripped off his coat, and bound him with feet and arms stretched out to the bench. Then a tall, stalwart fellow raised a huge paddle of wood to let fall with all his might on the bare flesh of the old man. But all this while the sky was darkening, and, before the first blow was given, the lightning flashed, the thunder rolled, and floods of rain fell that threatened to overwhelm house, garden, and all in a deluge. The hail which began to pelt the cattle was first the size of an egg, and then of stones like cannonballs. "Hold!" cried the frightened Mr. Poom. "I'll wait and ask further." Thereupon the lightning and thunder ceased, the sun burst out in splendor. Mightily impressed by this, Mr. Poom at last agreed to let his daughter become the bride of the frog, not telling her who her husband was to be. Within an hour, while she was getting ready, a string of fine horses and donkeys with palanquins loaded with presents for the bride and her family appeared. Besides boxes of silk dresses and perfumes, headgear, and articles for a lady's boudoir, there were troops of maidens to wait on the bride. Arraying Miss Peach in the loveliest of robes, they also dressed her hair until, what with satin puffs and frame, jade-tipped silver hairpins, rosettes, and flowers, her headgear stood over a foot high above her forehead, on which was the bride's red round spot. Then, when the happy maiden had sufficiently admired herself in the metal mirror and heard the praises of her attendant virgins, she entered the bridal palanquin, a gorgeous mass of splendor. According to custom, her eyes were sealed shut and covered with wax, for a Korean bride sees nothing of her husband until the end of the feast, when she meets him in the bridal chamber. So to his house she was carried in great pomp, and with gay attendants of brilliantly arrayed maidens. The marriage ceremony and the grand supper were happy affairs for all the guests, even though the bride, according to Korean etiquette, was as if blind, quietly and patiently waiting sightless throughout the whole joyful occasion. The actual ceremony was witnessed only by the foster parents and the bridegroom. When in the bridal chamber, the bride having unsealed her eyes and her vision being clear, she looked up at the one she had married and found not a man but a frog, she was furiously angry. She burst out into a protest against having such a bridegroom. Gently and in tenderest tones, the bridegroom attempted first to comfort her. Then, handing her a pair of scissors, he begged her to rip open the skin along his back from shoulder to thigh, for it was very tight and he was suffering pain from it. In her bitter disappointment at being married to a frog, she seized the scissors and almost viciously began to cut from nape to waist. Her surprise was great to find what seemed to be silk underneath the speckled skin. When she had slid down 2 yards or so, her husband the frog stood upon his hind legs. He twisted himself about as if in a convulsion, pulled his whole speckled hide hard with his front paws, and then jumping out of his skin, stood before his bride, a prince. Fair, tall, of superb figure, and gorgeously arrayed, he was the ideal of her dreams. A jeweled baldric bound his waist, embroidery of golden dragons on his shoulders and breast told of his rank, while on his head was the cap of royalty with a sparkling diamond in the center. Yet no clothes, handsome as they were, could compare in beauty with his glorious manhood. Never had she seen so fair a mortal. Happy was the bride whose feelings were thus changed in a moment from repulsion and horror to warmest affection and strongest veneration. The next morning when, to the amazement of his foster father and mother, Mr. and Mrs. Puck, the prince presented himself and his bride at breakfast, he told the story of his life. As son of the King of the Stars, he had committed some offense, in punishment for which his father condemned him to live upon the earth in the form of a frog. Furthermore, he had laid upon his son the duty of performing 3 tasks. These must be done before he should be allowed to come back and live in Starland. These were, to drink up all the water in the lake, to eat all the fish, and to win a human bride, the handsomest woman in the world. All the precious things which he had presented to Puck and his wife to make their old days comfortable, and the gifts sent to the bride's house before her wedding day, had come by power from the skies. Now, leaving his foster parents on earth to enjoy their gift, he must return home to his father, taking his bride with him. Scarcely had he spoken these words than a chariot and horses, silver bright, appeared at the door of the house. Bowing low to his foster parents, and stepping in with his bride, the pair disappeared beyond the clouds. From this time forth a new double star was seen in the sky. Shoes for hats. Many centuries ago, when Korea was named Chosen, or the land of morning splendor, the island kingdom out in the eastern sea where the sun rises, was called the land of the dragon, fly, which some foolish people call the devil's darning needle, because its body is so slender, its wings so wide, and its eyes so big. The Koreans called these islanders dwarfs, because they were not tall of stature, though they were very warlike and brave. The Isle men had no books or letters, and were very rude in their manners. Therefore many kind teachers, filled with the spirit of great Buddha, crossed the sea, from everlasting great Korea, to teach these islanders politeness, and how to read and write, and to build pagodas and temples and schools. This is the reason why these islanders, who had no storybooks or writing before the coming of the Korean teachers, have no ancient history of what happened long, long ago when Korea was a great country. So the grandmothers in the islands used to tell their children the good old fairy tales, which many elderly people know by heart and can relate without reading, thinking that the kings and queens they talked about were real people, when they were only dreams. The islanders call their country the land where the day begins, and there are many fairies in these islands, some good, some bad. So today, these island people make pictures in books and plays on the stage, and movies about these Koreans. They get up tableaux and pageants to tell how first the fairies and the king's servants from these far-off islands long ago came to Korea. They wanted to learn politeness, how to make and wear the proper kind of clothes, and how to draw and paint, how to make pictures, how to build houses, how to dance and sing and make music and play on instruments, how to teach and have schools. For the good fairies always like to do pretty things. Yet instead of being grateful for what they had received from Korea, there was one of these island people, a famous woman, who was envious because she lived in a poor land while the Koreans had a rich and beautiful country. Instead of swamps and grassy plains, with plenty of wild beasts and birds, and only a few people, poor and miserable, Korea was rich in rice fields and orchards full of fruit. Flowers grew in plenty. Birds, deer, and rabbits were numerous in the mountains, and the scenery was beautiful. In the warm waters, millions of fat fish swam and were easily caught, so the people had plenty of food to eat. Down along the bottom of the sea were most lovely water plants of rich colors, yellow, purple, green, and white, with seaweeds, corals, and sponges. In some of the sea caves lurked the giant crabs, cuttlefish, and every sort of marine monster. Still further down below, deeper than any line could fathom, dwelt the Dragon King of the world under the sea and his queen with genii and dragons and all her attendant maidens. These made sweet music, and here amid the mermaids the fairies had a happy time. These islanders had priests who went down by the seaside when the tide was low. There they called on the spirits of the deep to grant them a safe voyage, good luck, victory over the Koreans, and safe return. There they stood and watched the rippling waves as the breezes blew over the sea. The first living thing that poked its nose above the waters was the guardian of the seashore and the tides, called the salt-water giant. He came up with his head all covered with clam and oyster shells, seaweed, shrimps, and whatever grows in the sand or bottom of the ocean. He had to push aside hundreds of white jellyfish that bumped against him, as the clumsy old chap made his way up to the surface and then waded to the shore. Now this giant fairy was a grumpy sort of a fellow, and seeing the queen and her soldiers, he growled out, "What do you want?" Very politely, the queen's messenger made a soft answer to the big fellow and begged him to announce to his master, the Dragon King of the world under the sea, that the queen wished him to help her. Would he please order all the great fish and every sea monster to go ahead and pull her ship forward? Would he also present her with the 2 sparkling tide jewels which govern the ebb and the flood tides? If he would do so, then, in the one case, her enemies might be overwhelmed. In the other case, the ships of the Koreans would be left high and dry on the shore. Then she could march through the country and get all the gold and gems and furs and jewels and clothes and nice things to eat and bring them back to her own country. With the tide jewels in her hand, she could certainly conquer. "And if you please, one thing more," added the messenger. "What else do you want?" growled the saltwater giant. "Have your master, the Dragon King, give our queen power to capture many hundreds of the Korean artists, craftsmen, teachers, and men of books and letters. We shall make these men prisoners and bring them to our country and be civilized." "And what will you do in return to me and my master for all this?" roared the saltwater giant. His voice was like a booming cannon, for he was as mad as fire. "As soon as we get back safely to these shores, our queen will build a temple in honor of the Dragon King. We shall burn incense to him, and our people will pay him our devotions." "Well then, what else?" roared the saltwater giant. "There will be a shrine also dedicated to you, my lord, and we'll get the best Korean artist to decorate it in wave patterns, with drops of foam." The saltwater giant bowed and disappeared with a tremendous splash. Down, down, down he went to report to his master, the Dragon King of the world, under the sea. It was necessary for the dignity of his majesty that the queen and her soldiers should wait until flood tide, for the Dragon King never appeared except at high water. So the queen's servant launched her ship and waited out on the waves for the answer they hoped to get. No sooner did the tide mark on the sea beach show that the waves had reached the highest point of flood tide than the sea opened. The white foam curled round the queen's ship while all on board held their breath to see what was coming. They knew they would soon behold a sight to make them shiver, for the great deep was mightily stirred. King. It had eyes that seemed to flash fire. Then his majesty appeared. In a great seashell as big as a bushel and held in both hands, he had the 2 tide jewels. These he presented to the queen and then quickly disappeared beneath the waves. The last thing they saw was the dragon's head, which, besides the 2 eyes like lightning, had teeth that could bite a boat in half even when full of men. This monster could swallow down the whole crew in his mouth that was as wide as a man eating sharks. His enormously long black mustaches were as stout as ship's cables. Immediately after receiving the tide jewels, the queen of the barbarians landed on the southern coast of Korea. After a few weeks, having fought many battles with the Koreans, she made them bring to her their gold, jewels, furs, fans, rice, and pretty things. She and her people cared nothing about slaves or common prisoners, but whenever and wherever they could find a painter, an artist, a costumer, a maker of pottery, or a man of books, or a priest, they seized and took him along. They carried over with them to the island a great treasure of gems, gold, ornaments, and pretty clothes. They also took away many seeds of flowers and fruit trees, such as lemons, oranges, apples, and pears. In the islands to which they came, these smart men of skill and knowledge from Korea taught the islanders, who had lived like gypsies or Indians, how to build houses, palaces, and temples, to make fine clothes, to paint pictures, and to be like the Koreans and Chinese who knew all about these things. So the islands became rich in fruit, rice, grain, pagodas, and temples. After this, the island people wore lovely clothes and had fine manners. Now the islanders were great borrowers. They invented very few things themselves, but depended on their neighbors for much of what they had. So they filled both their heads and pockets from what they had brought from Korea, but they often made funny mistakes. When they wanted to learn about fine manners and fine clothes, they asked what, on solemn occasions and in time of ceremony, they should put on their heads. The Koreans were greatly offended at these savages from over the sea for invading their country and taking away their artists and craftsmen. So they now resolved to play a trick on the islanders. So when men from the isles in the ocean sent a company of men to Korea and asked for caps to put on their heads and be shown how do to things properly, the Koreans in contempt gave them their old shoes, which had strings on them to tie over their feet. But the islanders, who loved to go about with little clothing on their backs, and usually went barefoot, did not know what these shoes were. They thought these were some kind of headgear, hats or bonnets. So they put them on their heads like skull caps and tied them with the white strings down under their chins. These were like tapes and held the caps on around their necks. So to this day the islanders, when making offerings to the fairies, wear this headgear and think their shoe caps are very fine. The voice of the bell. When Taizhou, the great general and first king of Korea, founded a new dynasty, he moved the capital near the great river Han and resolved to build a mighty city called Hanyang, or the castle on the Han. It was to have a high wall around it and lofty gates on each side. However, the people commonly called the city Seoul, or capital. All the roads in the kingdom lead to it. Happy was he when the workmen, in digging for the foundations of the east gate, came upon a bell. It was a lucky omen, and they carried it at once to the king. He had it suspended over the entrance to his palace, and there it still hangs. But such a bell could only tinkle, while King Taizhou wanted one that would boom loud and long. He was especially anxious about this, for in Silla, once a rival state, there had hung for centuries one of the biggest bells in the world, and Taizhou wanted one that excelled even that famed striker of the hours. He would have even a larger bell to hang in the central square in the heart of Seoul, that could be heard by every man, woman, and child in the city. After that, it must be able to flood miles of hill and valley with its melody. By this sound, the people would know when to get up, cook their breakfast, sit down to supper, or go to bed. On special occasions, his subjects would know when a king's procession was passing, or a royal prince or princess was being married. It would sound out a dirge when, his majesty being dead, all the land must mourn, and the people wear white clothes for 3 years, and Korea becomes the land of mourners. The guardian spirit of the city would have its home in the bell. Word was sent out by messengers who rode on big horses, little ponies, donkeys, and bulls to all the provinces, publishing the king's command to all governors, magistrates, and village heads to collect the copper and tin to make the bronze metal. The bell was to stand 10 feet above the ground and be 8 feet across, that is, as high and wide as a Korean bedroom. On the top, forming the framework by which the bell was to be hung, were to be two terrible-looking dragons, weighing so many tons that it would balance 500 fat men on a seesaw. Only heavy beams made of whole tree trunks could hold it in the belfry, which must be strong enough to stand the shaking when the monster was rung. It had no clapper inside, but without, swung by heavy ropes from pulleys above, was a long log. This men pulled back and then let fly, striking the boss on the bell's surface. This awoke the music of the bell, making it toll, boom, rumble, growl, hum, croak, or roll sweet melody according as the old bellman desired. So the procession of bullock carts on the roads to Seoul creaked with the ingots of copper. Many a donkey had swallowed gallons of bean soup at the inn stables before he dropped his load of metal in the city, while hundreds of bulls bellowed under their weight of the brushwood and timber piled on their backs to feed the furnaces, which were to melt the alloy for the casting of the mighty bell. Deep was the pit dug to hold the core and mold, and hundreds of fire-clay pots and ladles were made ready for use when the red-hot stream should be ready to flow. All the boys in Seoul were waiting to watch the fire kindle, the smoke rise, the bellows roar, the metal run, and the foreman give the signal to tap. When the fire imp in the volcano heard of what was going on, he was awfully jealous, not thinking ever that common men could handle so much metal, direct properly such roaring flames, and cast so big a bell. He snorted at the idea that King Taizhou's men could beat the bells that hung in China's mighty temples or in Silla's pagodas. But when there was not yet enough and the copper collectors were still at their work, one of them came to a certain village and called at a house where lived an old woman carrying a baby boy strapped to her back. She had no coin, cash, metal, or fuel to give, but was quite ready to offer either herself or the baby. In a tone that showed her willingness, she said, "May I give you this boy?" The collector paid no attention to her, but passed on, taking nothing from the old woman. When in Seoul, however, he told the story. Thus it came to pass that many heard of the matter and remembered it later. So when all was ready, the fire-clay crucibles were set on the white-hot coals. The blast roared until the bronze metal turned to liquid. Then, at the word of the master, the hissing, molten stream ran out and filled the mold. Patiently waiting till the metal cooled, alas, they found the bell cracked. The casting was raised by means of heavy tackle, erected at great expense on the spot, and the bell was broken up into bits by stalwart blacksmiths wielding heavy hammers. Then a second casting was made, but again, when cool, it was found to be cracked. 3 separate times this happened, until the price of a palace had been paid for work, fuel, and wages, and yet there was no bell. King Taizhou was in despair. Yet instead of crying or pulling his topknot or berating the artisans who had done the best they could, he offered a large reward to anyone who could point out where the trouble lay or show what was lacking, and thus secure a perfect casting. Thereupon out stepped a workman from the company, who told the story of the old woman and said that the bell would crack after every cooling unless her proposal was accepted. Anyway, he said, the hag was a sorceress, and if the child were not a real human being, no harm could be done. So the baby boy was sent for, and, when the liquid metal had half filled the pit, was thrown into the mass. There was some feeling about feeding a child to the fire demon, but when they hoisted the cooled bell up from the mold, lo, the casting was a perfect success, and everyone apparently forgot about the human life that had entered the bell. Soon, with file and chisel, the great work was finished. The hanging ceremonies were very impressive when the bell was put in place on the city's central square, where the broad streets from the south gate and those looking to sunrise and sunset met together. Suspended by heavy iron links from the staple on a stout timber frame, the bell's mouth was exactly a foot above ground. Then, around and over it was built the belfry. The names of the chief artisans who cast the bell and of the royal officers who superintended the hanging ceremonies were engraved on the metal. It was decided, however, not to strike the bell until it was fully housed, and the sounder or suspended log of wood, as thick as the mast of a ship, was made ready to send forth the initial boom. Meanwhile, tens of thousands of people waited to hear the first music of the bell. Everyone believed it to be good luck, and that they would live the longer for it. The boys and girls could hardly go to bed for listening, and some were afraid they might be asleep when it boomed. The little folks, whose eyes were usually fast shut at sunset, begged hard to stay up that night until they could hear the bell, but some fell asleep because they could not help it, and their eyes closed before they knew it. "What shall the name of the bell be, your majesty?" asked a wise counselor. "Call it Injung," said King Taijo. "That means man decides, for every night at 9 o'clock let every man or boy decide to go to bed. Except magistrates, let not one male person be found in the street on pain of being paddled. From that hour until midnight the women shall have the streets to themselves to walk in." The royal law was proclaimed by trumpeters, and it was ordained also that every morning and evening, at sunrise and sunset, the band of music should play at the opening and shutting of the city gates. So Injung, or masculine decision, is the bell's name to this day. But as yet the bell was silent. It had not spoken. When it did sound, the Soul people discovered that it was the most wonderful bell ever cast. It had a memory and a voice. It could wail as well as sing. In fact, some to this day declare it can cry, for whether in childhood, youth, middle, or old age, in joy or gladness, the bell expresses their own feelings by its change of note, lively or gay, in warning or congratulation. At 9 o'clock in the first night of the 7th moon, the month of the Star Maiden of the Loom and the Ox Boy with his train of attendants, who stand on opposite sides of the river of heaven and cross over on the bridge of birds, the great bell of soul was to be sounded. All the men were in their rooms ready to undress and go to bed at once, while all the women, fully clothed in their best, were on the doorsteps ready, each with her lantern in hand, for their promenade outdoors. 4 strong men seized the rope, pulled back the striking log a whole yard's distance, and then let fly. Back bounded the timber, and out gushed a flood of melody that rolled across the city in every direction, and over the hills, filling leagues of space with sweet sound. The children clapped their hands and danced with joy. They knew they would live long, for they had heard the sweet bell's first music. The old people smiled with joy. But what was the surprise of the adult folks to hear that the bell could talk? Yes, its sounds actually made a sentence. Moo, ma, la, la, until it ended like a baby's cry. Yes, there was no mistake about it. This is what it said: "My mother's fault. My mother's fault." And to this day the mothers in soul, as they clasp their darlings to their bosoms, resolve that it shall be no fault of theirs if these lack love or care. They delight in their little ones more, and lavish on them a tenderer affection because they hear the great bell talk, warning parents to guard what heaven has committed to their care. The king of the sparrows. The Korean children are awakened every morning by the twittering of the sparrows. These little birds build their nests among the vines on the roof and along the eaves. The people plant melon, gourd, and mock orange seeds along the sunny sides of their houses in springtime. All through the summer and until late in autumn, the walls and roofs are covered with the thick green leaves. Here in these sheltered places, the sparrow mother lays her eggs, and the father sparrow finds worms and feeds her until the hungry birdies open their little mouths for something to eat. After this, both parents are kept busy in raising their brood and teaching them to fly. The greatest dangers to the birdlings come from cruel snakes that live on the roof and eat up the young sparrows. Sometimes, to help them against their enemy, the parent sparrows call in the aid of larger birds that are not afraid of the reptiles. These peck at the snake until they drive him away. There is always a lively chattering over the victory. One day, a young sparrow that had hardly learned to fly was almost seized and might have been devoured by the roof snake, but was saved by a big, brave bird that flew at the reptile. Although escaped from the snake's jaws, the sparrow in falling caught its legs in the curtain made of split bamboo which hung before the veranda of the house, and its limb was put out of joint. There it lay helpless between the splints. The owner of the house was a kind man who loved the birds. Taking pity on the poor sparrow, he carefully lifted it up, smoothed its feathers, and quieted the little creature while its heart kept beating so fast. Then, setting its leg in place, he put some moist clay around the broken part until it should be all right again. Meanwhile, he kept it warm, feeding the birdie until it was strong again. One day he took it in his hand and out of doors, letting it fly away. Soon it came back and perched on the edge of the roof, twittering thanks to its kind friend. Then it spread its wings to fly to the king of the sparrows who lived in the city of Sparrow Capital, where it at once informed his majesty about the good man who healed and befriended birds when they were in trouble and who had saved the young sparrow's life. The king of Sparrowland and all his wise counselors heard the story with great interest. Then they held a meeting and voted to reward richly so good a friend of all sparrows. So they went into the storehouse, where were kept beautiful treasures which human beings love. From the collection they chose what they thought would please most their good friend, such as gold, jade, brocade, cups and saucers, rice horses to ride on, oxen to bear heavy loads, and pretty maids to wait on him, besides silk and cotton clothes of all sorts, with delicious things to eat and drink. By some magic process they packed these into a seed and then gave it to the sparrow in its bill to carry to the good man. They charged the bird on no account to lose it, and be sure to give it to no one but the right person. So the sparrow flew out of Sparrowland and down to the house of its kind friend. Carefully laying down the seed, it kept near the paper window frame and made a great twittering until the man came out to see what was the matter. Recognizing his old acquaintance, he put out his open hand, and the sparrow laid the seed in his palm, meanwhile chattering in a lively way, and looking in his face as if to tell him how precious the treasure was. But the good fellow only took it in to his wife and told her how he got it, laughed over the matter, and was going to throw it away, thinking it only sparrow fun. The wife, who was a wise woman, begged her husband to keep it, and on a warm day in spring she planted it. It grew to be a luxuriant vine that clothed all one side of the house with its leaves. When one unusually fine, large, handsome gourd was nearly ripe, the man thought of plucking it for food, but, taking his wife's advice, he waited until full autumn had come. By this time the gourd, having absorbed the sunshine all summer, was fully ripe. Then they took a saw to open it properly, and lo! A store of riches came out of that gourd, such as neither the man nor his wife had ever dreamed of. A table of costly jade, such as an emperor ever eats from. Next rolled forth a silver bottle of delicious wine, and then the daintiest cups that set themselves on the jade table. Soon a gold tea-caddy appeared, filled with the fragrant leaf. Then rolls of silk, fine muslin, satin brocade, and a store of rich clothes, hats, shoes, girdles, and socks enough to last a lifetime appeared before their eyes. After these were rice and cooked food of all sorts ready for a feast. Looking out into the yard, they saw strong horses and fat oxen waiting to do their master's bidding. Last of all, some lovely young girls, as fair as the moon, stepped out of the gourd and proceeded to serve the good things of the feast, as if they had been used to waiting on ladies and gentlemen all their lives. Following the feast, they danced, made music, and gave no end of entertainment and service to the man and his wife, who were now as happy as king and queen. In their once humble home, now made over new, with all the store of good things and plenty of loyal servants and strong animals to serve them, the old couple lived without care and traveled where they pleased. But when a wicked man that hated all sparrows and had often driven them away from his house because he thought them too troublesome, heard of his neighbor's good fortune, he was envious and wanted to get riches in the same way. So he watched his opportunity, and, when a sparrow came near, he threw a stick at the bird and broke its leg. Then he bound up the limb with clay and a bit of rag. He kept the poor sparrow until its leg was well, but dreadfully crooked, and then let it fly away. In the capital of Sparrowland, the poor bird told about the bad man's doings. The Sparrow King at once handed out a seed to be given to the enemy of the sparrows. When the naughty man saw the little bird with the crooked legs, he ran out, got the seed, and planted it at once. He could hardly wait for the gourd to ripen. Wonderful to relate, however, the vine was most luxurious, covering the whole side of the house and all the thatched roofs of the 3 dwellings in one, which made up his home. Finally, in the autumn, he plucked the fruit. Then, sitting down before the pile with knife and saw, he began to open them. But instead of good things and lovely people and the treasures that make men rich and happy, such as his kind neighbor had received, there came out, one after another, the 12 curses of Korea. Demanded money. They threatened to live with him and eat at his table unless they got their pay. There was no help for it. So the cruel man had to give each dancer a long string of cash before he could get rid of the party. No sooner had he opened the second gourd than out stepped a line of Buddhist priests who at once began begging for the temples. He was only too glad to buy off these shaven pates. The saw had no sooner let the light into another gourd than forth came a band of hired mourners carrying a corpse. They began weeping, wailing, and crying out loud enough to waken the dead. It required another rope of cash to get rid of these pests. By this time the cruel man was beginning to feel very poor. Almost afraid to touch the other gourds, but still greedily hoping for riches, he sawed them open, but one after the other yielded only what took his money and threatened to make him a beggar. From the 4th gourd issued a bevy of dancing girls, who refused to leave the house until he had paid them 5,000 cash. From another gourd a pair of acrobats leaped out and began a performance. But knowing that they would charge the more for their tricks if they were allowed to finish their program, the man bought them off as he had done the others. Getting poorer and poorer, with no sign of wealth coming from the gourds, he yet felt he must open more, but the result was the same. The strangest people, men and women, such as loafers from the government offices, fortune-tellers, jugglers, and blind folks appeared. These last had sticks in their hands to find the way, and bells at their belts to collect alms. Finally, of all living things, a giant stood forth that threatened to eat up both the man and his wife. By this time there was not a coin or a cash left, and, besides being as poor as a rat, the man was hungry. When the 12th gourd was opened, it seemed to have in it all the smells of Korea. Holding their noses, the man and his wife ran out of their house. Happily for them that they did so, for just then a gale of wind blew down the house, and the thatch and timbers burst into flames from the fire that had heated the flues. Thus stripped of all their possessions, because of the man's cruelty to the birds, the wicked fellow and his wife would have starved, except for the kindness of the good man who treated the sparrows kindly. For the rest of their days the old couple lived on their neighbor's charity. The woodman and the mountain fairies, Over 500 years ago, there lived in a northern village near Pingyang a woodcutter named Kiel Wee. He owned a sturdy bull that carried on its back the fuel which he daily cut on the mountains and sold on the main street of his village at the fair, which was held every 5th day. The docile brute could carry a load of faggots and brushwood piled many feet high over his head and tied down with ropes, so that at a distance nothing but his legs were visible. This beast, although so huge, was the gentlest creature imaginable. The children were all very fond of the big fellow and were accustomed to play with him as if he were one of them, or at least like a pet dog. The reason of this was that when but a week old, the bull calf had been taken from his cow mother and brought up in the family with the girls and boys. Only the puppy dog that also occupied the house with the young folks was a great favorite. On a fine summer morning, Kiel Wee, leaving his beast behind, went up on the mountain and cut enough wood to load up and bring down on another day. His wife, as she shouted goodbye, told him to be sure and be home in time for supper, for their eldest son had gone a-fishing and a good string of perch was expected. Shouldering his axe, he started up the mountain path. He had to go pretty far, for near towns or cities in Korea all the timber had long since been cut away. Every year the woodmen have to search farther afield to find fuel. Arriving in the woods where there was a clearing, Kiel Wee prepared to wield his trusty axe. He was about to take off his big hat and outer coat and lay about him when he spied, at some distance off, 2 fairy-like beings. They had long hair, looked very wise, and were dressed in costume of the Chow dynasty of 2,000 years ago. They sat on stones and played the game of go-ban. Coming near, the woodman took a respectful attitude and, looking on, soon became interested in the moves of the players. So far from being at all disconcerted at the presence of a stranger, the 2 fairies seemed by eye winks to invite him to look on. Feeling quite proud to be thus honored, Kiel Wee, leaning his chin upon the handle of his axe, became absorbed in the game, and by grew quite excited. Forgetting himself and his manners, he stretched forth his right hand to move one of the pieces. At once the fairy nearest to him gave him a crack on the fingers for his impudence, and jerked Kiel Wee's arm away. Then, without saying a word, he took out from his wallet something that looked like a persimmon seed and put in the woodman's mouth. After this, all 3 were perfectly quiet. Hour after hour the game proceeded, and the players grew more intensely interested. As for Kiel Wee, his eyes never winked, so hard did he look at the yellow board covered with the black and white pieces. Several times, when he thought he saw how the fairy on his right could beat in the game, or the one on his left make a better move, he felt like telling one or the other so. When, however, he tried to move his tongue, he found he could not speak or utter a cry. Somehow he felt as if he were in a dream. Yet all the time he became more and more wrapped up in the game, so that he determined to see the end of it and know which player had beaten. He forgot that with mountain spirits there is no night or morning or passing of the hours, nor do they care anything about clocks or bells, because in fairyland there is no time. All the while Kiel Wee was leaning with his chin on the stout axe handle, holding it with both hands under his neck. He took no note of the sun or stars, daylight or darkness, and he felt no hunger. Suddenly the timber of his axe seemed to turn to dust, and his chin fell. The next thing he knew, he had lost his support. Down went his head, and forward fell his body as he tumbled over, upsetting the checkerboard, breaking up the game, and scattering the round pieces hither and yon over the ground. Awaking as out of a sleep, and thoroughly ashamed of himself for his impoliteness, he tried to pick himself up and humbly apologize for the accident which he had caused by his own rudeness. He expected and was ready for a good scolding, but when he looked up, the fairies were gone. Nothing whatever was seen of them or of the playboard and checkers, nor any signs of their having been there, except that when he put his hand on the flat stones which they had used as seats, he found them warm to his touch. But where was his axe handle, and what had happened? When he had left home, he had come straight from the barber shop with his face smooth and clean-shaven. Now he put his hand to his breast and found that he had grown a long white beard. As for the iron axe head, it was there, but rusty and half buried in the ground. He had worn one of the big farmer's hats, which, when turned upside down, might hold a bushel or two of turnips, and when fastened to his head spread over his shoulders like a roof. Where could it be? He looked about him to find it, but saw only the bits of the slats inside the frame, and a few scraps of what remained, for the rest had long ago rotted away. Meanwhile, he had discovered that his joints were stiff, and he felt like an old man. His clothes were a mass of rags, his hemp sandals were no more, and on both fingers and toes had grown long nails like birds' claws. His hair had burst its topknot string and hung down his back like a woman's, only it was grayish-white. Wondering what it all meant, Kiwi hobbled down the mountain and found the road that ran into the main street of his village. Rocks and hills, rivers and rills were there, but what a change! Instead of the two grinning idol posts, of male and female faces carved out of trunks and trees, with sawed-out teeth painted white, and artificial ear-flaps of wood nailed on, such as had stood before every Korean hamlet since the days of Kija, there was a line of high, thick poles with iron wire stretching from one to the other, and for miles in the distance. These, he found out afterward, were called lightning thread trees, telegraph poles. In place of the rambling and sprawling three-sided thatched houses and yards, divided off with mats hung from sticks, there was a well-built but odd-looking office of painted wood, with openings through which he saw Korean young men sitting. They were dressed in strange clothes and were fingering outlandish-looking clicking instruments. His curiosity prompted him to go up and look more closely, when something bumped against his nose and nearly knocked him over. When he tried again to get closer, his face was flattened, his nose nearly broken, and his lips knocked against his teeth so that they swelled. Feeling with his hands to solve the mystery, he touched something hard, which he could yet see through. Just then he heard a young man inside shout to him in Korean, "Here, you mountain daddy, let that glass alone." "Glass, glass," thought Kiwi. "What is that?" Yet he could not speak. He had hardly drawn a long breath when, looking down along two lines of shining iron in the street, he saw a house on wheels coming right at him. There was no horse, no donkey, no bull, no man pulling or pushing it, but overhead was a long pole, at the end of which, where it touched a string, as he thought, though it was an iron wire, was something that looked like a squirrel. It was going round and round as if turning somersaults, and seemed to be pushing the moving house along. Inside, near the same stuff which he had already heard was glass, sat a dozen or so Koreans. The whole thing, wheels and all, nearly ran over him as it thundered by, and his mouth opened in wonder, while a man on the end shouted rudely, "Hullo, old goblin, where did you get your pumpkin mouth? Look out or you'll swallow the moon. Get out of the way of the trolley." Thus did the man they called conductor or guard make fun of the poor old fellow, for indeed he did look like one of the mummers, who on New Year's Eve amuse or scare the children by putting on their shoulders the huge round devil heads and false faces that represent the aborigines of Korea, and the goblins that once lived in the mountains. These masks are usually shaped like a melon and are cut with eyes, nose, and mouth, like those which American boys have fun with on All Hallow Eve. This was just the trouble. The woodman in tatters, with no topknot, long hair down his back and a white beard floating over his breast, leaning on a long white stick as he hobbled down the street, looked just like one of the ancient aborigines that had long ago been driven into the mountains. Nurses and old women frightened naughty children by simply mentioning their names. When one of these mountain men, odd creatures that were half savage in dress and ways, came into the town, all the children laughed and the big dogs barked, while the little ones ran away, for the sight was so unusual. Even the bulls bellowed, The donkeys balked and the pigs squeaked as Kiwi came near. No wonder he was taken for a mountain granddaddy, or a bumpkin dressed up like one, for few of the city or village folks had really ever seen one of the mountain aborigines any more than they had seen tigers that are plentiful farther away, but which only the hunters ever caught sight of. More and more bewildered, Kiwi wended his way further into the town. He saw that the men no longer wore topknots or chignons, nor did the lads have on the long braid down their back, which showed that they were youths but not married yet. Just then some rough boys, supposing that maybe some rustic gawk had mistaken the time of year, jeered at him and cried, "Hello, hermit, do you think it's New Year's Eve?" Kiwi thought he had better ask some questions. So, catching sight of a dignified-looking gentleman in black broad-brimmed hat and flowing white clothes who was coming down the street and toward him, Kiwi bowed his head low, almost to the ground. As he did so, the stone put in his mouth by the fairies dropped out, and his tongue was loosed. He inquired as follows, "Exalted sir, can you tell me where may be the wretched hut of my miserable wife and children? She was the daughter of Ji Kim, and your contemptible slave is Kiwi." The gentleman, whose dress showed that he was a scholar and person of rank, looked long and hard at the questioner, to satisfy himself that he was not being mocked, or imposed upon by a jester, rope dancer, sorcerer, or some such disreputable person, and then cried, "Heavens, man, are you a beggar spirit of the mountains? Your speech sounds like the dialect spoken in these parts 500 years ago. In that time such a family lived here, but the head of it, a woodcutter and fuel seller, is reported to have gone up into the mountains and was eaten up by a tiger. Yonder in the graveyard are buried 10 or more generations of his descendants. Tell me, kind sir, what has happened here since King Wang died? It was under his reign that I was born and lived in this village." Still eyeing the questioner, as if expecting to see him jump out of his rags and declare himself a mummer and the whole affair a joke, the kindly gentleman proceeded to give in outline the history of Korea during the previous 500 years. There had been many kings. The Tartars first, and then the Japanese had invaded the land. A great war between the Mikado's men and the Chinese had taken place. It was just over, and now people rode in cars, talked hundreds of miles over wires, and traveled over iron rails as fast as a dragon could fly, drawn by a steel horse that drank water and fed on wood and black stones that burned. In a word, Korea was in an era of civilization. This was too much for Kiwi. He now realized that he had lived 10 times longer than the average man. So, hobbling over to the graveyard, he stumbled among the mounds until he found that one of his clan where the bones of his wife and children lay. Next morning, all that was seen of Kiwi was a mass of dust, rags, some bones, and much long white hair. Yet when they buried him, there sprang up around and on his grave strange flowers that no one had ever seen in city or village, but which bloomed only on the high mountains.